Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Welcome. I'm Alan Lowe, the Executive Director of the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. We really appreciate you being here tonight. I cannot tell you how excited I am to have my good friend Jeff Engel here with us. But before we get to his lengthy introduction, I want to let you know about our next special exhibit. If you haven't heard, opening on March 23rd, we will open From Illinois to the White House, Lincoln, Grant, Reagan, Obama. All about those four presidents with deep Illinois roots, showing that in this bicentennial year, Illinois should be proud of its contributions to national leadership over the last 200 years. So we have a lot of really cool items coming in for this exhibit. We saw a few today that have already arrived. For example, we'll have the cards that President Reagan used to make his famous Berlin Wall speech, where he said, "Tear down this wall." The saddle that Grant used at the end of the Civil War, as well as the surrender table from Appomattox. A 3D bust made of President Obama by the National Portrait Gallery, and Lincoln's briefcase in which we believe he stored drafts of the Emancipation Proclamation. So those and many other items telling the story of those four men that had those deep Illinois roots. Again, opens March 23rd and runs through the end of this bicentennial year. Also, I'll put a plug in for tomorrow at 2 o'clock here in the library. We'll be teaming up with our partners from the Hoagland Theater to speak about Lyndon Johnson, LBJ. As you may know, our director of theater, Phil Funkenbush, is directing All the Way, a terrific play about LBJ and the Civil Rights Act at the Hoagland in early March. It's already had 3 dates there. It also is playing the 9th, 10th, and 11th of March, so later this week. Tomorrow afternoon, I'm going to join Phil, as well as two actors from All the Way, Rich McCoy, who plays LBJ, and Patrick Foster, who portrays Everett Dirksen, the great Illinois senator. And they're going to be here with me. I'm going to give a good background in LBJ, some of his very, so I always say, colorful life, and to use some of the great LBJ tapes. If you haven't listened to those online, you should. And then turn it over to Mr. McCoy and Mr. Foster to talk about the play and how they portray those two very important men. It promises to be a really fun afternoon tomorrow, starting at 2 o'clock, I believe right here in this very room. So please do join us then if you can. Now, to tonight's speaker. Jeff Engel is the director of the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. Got his PhD, his master's and PhD from the University of Wisconsin in Madison. They beat UK a few years ago at basketball. I still haven't forgiven Jeffrey for that, but otherwise it's a fine, fine university. Prior to coming to SMU, Jeff had taught at Texas A&M's Bush School of Government and Public Service, was director of programming and interim director of the Scowcroft Institute for International Affairs at A&M, and earlier had held positions at Yale and the University of Pennsylvania. He's received too many awards for me to list. I probably should, but I'm not going to list all of them. I'll pick a few. He received the Bernath Lecture Prize from the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations, the Texas A&M Achievement Award for teaching. He's a wonderful teacher, as well as a great scholar, and more fellowships than I can count, including with the Smithsonian, the Nobel Institute, Yale, and West Point. It's really well published. I first heard of Jeff. Before I ever met him, I read the work he edited called The China Diary of George H.W. Bush, a really great read if you ever get an opportunity to pick that up. And now, of course, he's completed When the World Seemed New, a book getting really great reviews, all about Bush 41, the end of the Cold War, and the beginning of a new era in world history. The reviews are indeed terrific, rightly so. I hope you all got a copy tonight. If you didn't, you'll have an opportunity afterwards to get that and have Jeff sign it after the presentation. I got to know Jeff at SMU, where he created and ran the Center for Presidential History. At that point, I was the director of the George W. Bush Library there on the SMU campus, and worked hand in hand with Jeff and his terrific crew at the CPH, the Center for Presidential History. They were always amazing partners for us. We joined together on a lot of programs, a lot of public programs at SMU. I'm going to be one of those programs in April, going down and speaking for them. I'm looking forward to that in Dallas in April. In addition to those programs, Jeff and his team conduct a lot of research on the presidency. They've begun compiling a truly amazing oral histories about the presidency. And on top of that, as I said, he's a great teacher in the history department at SMU. So we worked together a lot, but more importantly than that, Jeff became a true and really close friend. That friendship was cemented by teaching together every summer at SMU's Cultural Institute in Taos, New Mexico. As I always said, that was not a bad gig at all, ladies and gentlemen. We go out there every summer and teach a class of 40 to 50 people for 2 days on some topic related to the presidency. We had a lot of fun doing that, despite having some pretty intense debates in front of our class. Actually, the class loved it the most when we got in pretty terrific fights in front of them, all done out of love, of course. and made better by the fact that Jeff's parents would often join us out there, and they're terrific as well. So really, really great memories of Taos. I could not be more pleased to have my good friend here tonight. Please join me in welcoming Jeffrey Engel.
Make sure I'm on. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, but before I go into the pleasure part, let me just express how absolutely angry I am at all of you, because the single best thing about my job at SMU was being able to work with Alan, and you stole him away. So I would like to be gracious and say, your gain is my loss, but I'm not that gracious. So I will hold retribution later. So, but thank you for having me, and it's wonderful to be here, and also to go through the wonderful library here. It's really just an incredible resource that you have here, and I'm sure you all obviously appreciate it so much. So what I'd like to talk to you today is obviously about the subject of my latest book, but more importantly, I want to put that in a broader context to really hearken back to a period in history that we typically think of as an optimistic time, as a good period. I'm speaking of the late 1980s, the early 1990s, what we know subsequently became the end of the Cold War. It was a period in history where the world, frankly, seemed to be looking towards the United States not only with admiration, not only as an example, but, and this is hard to imagine in many ways today, but with great affection as well. That is to say, not only did the world at that time seem to be turning in a democratic, free market, capitalist version of the United States following our leadership, but we were very popular around the world as well. So popular, in fact, that even before President Bush, who I'm going to discuss, took office, there was a man named Francis Fukuyama who came up with a theory, actually published a few months after Bush took office, a theory which he referred to as the end of history, which I have to tell you is the single worst understood title, perhaps, in all of history. Because most people, when they heard Fukuyama, a young political scientist, had worked actually at the State Department for a while, when they heard him talk about the end of history, they presumed that Fukuyama was saying, nothing ever is going to happen again. That's not what he was saying. What he was actually saying was that all of human history, up until this point, had essentially been a grand struggle and a grand competition to figure out, well, frankly, how we're all supposed to govern ourselves. What system of government works well? And we tried a lot. We tried pharaohs, we tried kings, we tried czars. In fact, by the 20th century, he argues, we basically come down to the final three. In fact, I like to think of this is my metaphor, not his. I like to think of this as a massive NCAA bracket, if you will, of governments competing against each other and then being pushed to the side when we realize they don't work. And the 20th century had gone down to the final three: communism, democracy, and fascism. Of course, World War II does away with fascism. And the Cold War, if you will, are the finals: communism against democracy. And lo and behold, Fukuyama argues, by the end of the 1980s, we know who's going to win. That is to say, even the communist world is turning democratic. Even the head of the communist world, that is the Soviet Union, has begun to adopt from the mid-1980s on a series of democratic and free market reforms. In fact, the best example of really how to understand what Fukuyama was arguing was a review that came out in the New York Times of his article, which essentially argued the following: we win, and isn't that great? Because he argued that now that we have gotten down to one, all of future history is going to be democratic. That was the end of history. Yes, there's still going to be fights. Yes, there's still going to be conquests. As long as human beings have emotions, there's, of course, always going to be some form of struggle. But it's going to be always, he argued, in a democratic context. What's fascinating about this article and the subsequent best-selling book that Fukuyama published, which I have to say, if you really take back and read Fukuyama, which, by the way, nobody ever does, it's really an incredibly dense, thick book discussion based upon how to read history based on Hegelian dialectics, which makes it by far the best-selling book ever on Hegelian dialectics. But what was fascinating about what he said was that George H.W. Bush said exactly the same thing 2.5 months earlier. Now, I have no reason to suspect that there's plagiarism going on here because he used different terms, he used different words, but what George H.W. Bush, in January of 1989, In his inaugural address, only moments after taking the oath of office and becoming president, standing in front of a very large crowd, he actually said, "We now know what works." He said, "We no longer have to stare at the fire in the middle of the night and ask ourselves and debate what the best form of government is. We know freedom works," he argues. Freedom creates the best opportunity for humanity, free markets create the best prosperity, and a free society can fulfill the best that we have to offer. And this is the basic sentiment that George H.W. Bush took into office in January of 1989, and on a more fundamental level, this is the story of Bush's life as well. Because when George H.W. Bush talked about freedom being the ideal form of government, he never actually questioned whether that was so or not. Because he was a man who had lived not only at the very pinnacle of American society, and not only had served during the pinnacle, if you will, in many ways, of American power, that is, in the Pacific during World War II, but also had grown up and evolved and been a successful businessman and then politician and then government policymaker during the heights of the American century. For him, it seemed rather axiomatic and obvious that freedom was, of course, the ideal system for the world. And as he understood it, understood the end of history, understood his coming into office in 1989, the grand ship of state, if you will, the stream of history, was moving our way. And in fact, it had always been moving our way, and it's just that the rest of the world had finally figured out just how right we were, that freedom and democracies was the way to go. And here's the kicker. What that meant for George H.W. Bush when he took office was that if the world is going our way, as leader of the United States, and as leader, therefore, of the free world, as, if you will, captain of the ship of state that is going in the right direction, his job was not to change course. His job was to make sure we continued in the right direction. His job was to make sure that we did not, if you will, to abuse the metaphor further, hit any rocky shoals or run aground, which is a lot harder than you might think when you remember that George Bush took office in January of 1989 during what I would argue is perhaps the most single, tumultuous, and dangerous period, maybe in all of human history, which is a pretty big statement. When a historian ever begins saying all of human history, you gotta start listening up. Because the argument is essentially that when we think about the end of the Cold War, that democratic, optimistic time I just described to you, you can spin it in a different direction and recognize that the end of the Cold War, the collapse, if you will, of European communism, which ultimately leads to the collapse of the Soviet Union, is a remarkably dangerous period because all throughout human history, whenever great empires had collapsed, great power wars had ensued. You really can't find a single instance where a great empire collapse creates a vacuum, if you will, of power, and nothing else rushes in to fill the power but violence and conflict. Oh, but there's something else going on at the end of the Cold War that makes it all the more dangerous. This is the first time that humanity had ever run this experiment of what happens when a major great power collapses with 20,000 nuclear weapons in the mix. That is to say, the first time that humanity had run this great power collapse experiment with the power, if you will, to destroy humanity in the process. So I argue that Bush took office in a period where he saw the world going in the right direction, and his job was to make sure that we didn't hit those rocky shoals, and there were rocky shoals aplenty. Most specifically in two particular areas. The first, of course, being the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, Eastern Europe, the Soviet Empire traditionally understood, and of course, Communist China. And China actually is the best place to start, because in China, we can see everything that could go wrong. That is to say, you might remember the spring of 1989 and the early summer of 1989. If you were to understand that in a Chinese context, you wouldn't think about democracy triumphing. You would think about instead, well, frankly, protests and democracy being crushed. This is the spring and the summer of Tiananmen Square. And what's really important when I say this is the spring and summer of Tiananmen Square is that you all know exactly what I mean. Because this is the moment in history where Tiananmen Square goes from being a place to an event. That is to say that you immediately think of the crackdown on students in particular, but on a broader democratic movement that was sprung up almost indigenously 10 years after Deng Xiaoping had essentially unleashed a democratic capitalist contagion, if you will, into his country. Deng Xiaoping, who of course took over after Mao Zedong and inserted a new idea in Chinese communism that it was okay to be successful. It was okay to make money. It was okay, if you will, to move ahead of your fellow man and woman so long as you did so because of your own ingenuity, because of your own entrepreneurship. And in fact, to be honest, that's the real reason that the students of 1989, and there had been student protests in 85, in 86, in 87, in 88, they sprung up, but in 89 in particular, that's the real reason that they were protesting. In fact, this is one of two things, which I'm going to say tonight, that usually makes people really mad. So I'll tell you when the second one's about to come, so you can prepare yourself. When the students at Tiananmen Square held up signs saying, "We want democracy, we want freedom," and American policymakers like George Bush, like his Secretary of State, James Baker, like his National Security Advisor, Brent Scowcroft, read those signs, they immediately interpreted what the Chinese students were doing as part of their overall narrative that the world is moving in our direction. People are turning towards freedom. Bush said it in January of 1989, and the students began protesting in May of 1989. Basically, if you say something and it becomes true, this makes policymakers think they were right the entire time. But here's the kicker. They read those signs. That should cause you to pause. They read signs that said, "We want freedom, we want democracy," because those signs were written in English. George Bush, despite having spent time in China, despite, to be honest, considering himself a China expert, though I personally think that that was an overstatement on his part, he didn't know any Chinese, didn't even know much Chinese history, but he knew students saying, "We want democracy, we want freedom," because those signs were written in English so that global opinion, formed through CNN cameras, could hopefully get on their side. But here's the part that's going to make you mad, usually. The freedom that the Chinese students were advocating for was not the freedom that George H.W. Bush envisioned. That is to say, there's a different definition of freedom than Bush understood. Bush understood freedom to mean ballots. Bush understood freedom to mean civil liberties. Bush understood freedom to mean, well, yes, markets as a natural extension of that. The Chinese students in '89, actually, when they meant freedom, what they really meant was equality. But equality as defined by the actual Chinese Communist Party constitution, which was very clear that the purpose of the party was to ensure equality for all of its people. And equality they understood as meaning making sure that there was no nepotism, making sure there was no corruption, making sure that, as Deng Xiaoping had said, if you want to achieve anything you can based upon your own merit and based upon your own entrepreneurial ability, that there isn't something else standing in the way. That's what equality means to these students. And in fact, what's important to recognize about these students is just that they were that, students. The reason this democratic movement sprung up among that class of people was because they really were protesting. We now know from their oral histories, we know from memoirs, we know from new documentary evidence, and actually really brave work done by a lot of Chinese historians. I have to tell you, this is not an easy area to research in contemporary China. If you're not aware, the Chinese government does not like the term crackdown, referring to Tiananmen Square. They do not like to talk about oppression at Tiananmen Square. In fact, small story, Alan referenced the China diary that I did with President Bush, from his time in China. And when we came to publish that book, the Chinese ambassador actually protested directly to myself, to the press, and to the president's office. The reason they protested this book and refused to let it be published in China was because I referred to Tiananmen as a crackdown. To which I responded, "Would you prefer brouhaha?" But, But the idea being that that was not the way they wanted the history remembered. But the reason the students have been protesting in the first place, we now know, is because they were upset that the people who had the best grades were not getting the best jobs. The people who were getting the best jobs were the people who, frankly, whose fathers had the best job. By the way, something that still continues on in China today. So the students at Tiananmen argued initially for a new sense of equality, and then, frankly, things spun out of control, which is to say, when asked for reforms, the government responded by asking the students to disband. The students decided not to disband, which meant the government called them criminals, which necessarily meant that they thought of themselves as revolutionaries. One thing leads to another, and you've all seen the pictures of the tanks eventually mowing down the students and clearing out the square. And this, in many ways, is the nightmare scenario for George Bush. Remember the chronology. He comes to office in 1989, January. This occurs in June of 1989. And throughout the rest of 1989, Bush is witnessing a series of successive, very similar-looking democratic protests throughout the Soviet Union and the Soviet Empire, in Warsaw, in Budapest, ultimately in East Germany, and then in Czechoslovakia, and then ultimately even in Romania, of all places, one of the most draconian communist states ever created. In place after place, people began to protest for some version of freedom. What that version is, actually, I would argue, is different for each individual culture and each individual nation. But at the very least, we all know they're holding up signs in English for the CNN cameras, which means policymakers around the world believe that they are marching for the same thing. And Bush not only has the memory of Tiananmen Square, or if you will, the warning of Tiananmen Square, that is to say, here's what happens when things can go bad, when a government can crack down. Bush, of course, has a much longer understanding of history, which is to say he knows this is not the first time in world history, or during the Cold War even, when people had protested against communism. They had done so in 1953 in East Germany. They had done so in 1956 in Budapest. They had done so in 1968 in Prague. They had done so in 1981 in Warsaw. And in each of those occasions, the communist authorities ultimately used force to crack down. They sent the tanks in 53. They sent the tanks in 68. They sent the tanks in 56. Interestingly enough, the Soviets didn't send the tanks in 1981 to crush Solidarity. There, they were a little bit more sophisticated. They made it very clear to the Polish government that if you did not impose martial law on your own people, we will. And when I say very clear, I want to be explicit in how they made this threat. Having used tanks against foreign peoples before, the Soviets quite literally put 2 tank divisions on the Polish border and revved their engines so that the people in Warsaw understood, if we don't move, they will. So every time there was protest in Eastern Europe, a crackdown occurred. And this posed a real problem for Bush, a real fundamental problem of how, if you're the president and you think the world is going in the right direction, do you keep things moving in a democratic way and not promote the crackdown that ultimately occurred at Tiananmen? And you have a secondary layer problem here, which is that the man who is responsible for all this tumult, all this democratic excitement in the Soviet Union, in the communist world, is a man named Mikhail Gorbachev, who you're not sure in 1989 that you necessarily want to trust. For a really interesting reason, which is to say that Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985 promising perestroika, promising glasnost, that is to say reform, restructuring, and openness, essentially embracing new Western European democratic ideas. The Western European part is important. Not for the purpose of changing the Soviet Union into a democratic state, for the purpose of saving the Soviet Union as a socialist state itself. Make no mistake and never pretend that Mikhail Gorbachev, who came to power again in 85, wanted to do away with the Soviet Union. His entire process, his entire goal was to save the Soviet Union. But Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 85 and did a very unusual thing for a policymaker, which is to say he not only recognized that he had a problem, he was willing to do something about it. And we all know how rare that is among politicians as a general proposition. And the problem that he identified was one that Soviet leaders had identified from the mid-1970s on, which is to say they recognize their economy was not keeping pace. Their society was not keeping pace. Their science and technology was not keeping pace. Not so much with the United States, but with the people they actually cared about, which was Western Europe. That is to say, from 1945 on, they had witnessed Western Europe's standard of living and technological advancement, the social welfare states of what eventually became part of the European Union, which of course is coming into being at the same time in the late 1980s, early 1990s. They saw that moving forward, and they saw Soviet progress, which had been particularly impressive in the late 40s and 50s, begin to decline from the 60s and 70s on. I'll give you a great statistic for this, which is that in 1989, the average daily caloric intake for a Soviet citizen was precisely the same as it had been in 1917. That is to say, the entire Soviet experience had gone on from their perspective, and our people are no better off. What's really important about that date, by the way, 1989 and 1985, and what I mentioned in the early 1970s, that Mikhail Gorbachev, among others, recognized this problem. Actually, let me give you an anecdote before I tell you what's really important about it. The best way to understand how most Soviet policymakers from the 70s understood their problem and what they were going to do about it is really best exemplified by the following joke, which if you heard, meant you were in trouble. But that's a different story. It's safer now. So the joke is as follows, that Joseph Stalin, Nikita Khrushchev, and Leonid Brezhnev, who was the major Soviet leader of the 70s and 80s, they're all riding in a train together. And the train stops. At which point, being good Soviet leaders, they look at each other and say, how are we going to get this thing moving again? And Stalin, being Stalin, goes first. And he says, it's very simple. All we do is we gather up all the local peasants from the nearby village, we shoot half of them, and then the other half will be really incentivized to get the train moving. And they debate this for a while, and finally Khrushchev says, no, it's much easier than that. All we need to do is denounce the previous train driver, and then we'll be fine, which of course is what Khrushchev had done to Stalin. At which point Brezhnev, the key to the story, the man in charge in the 70s and early 80s, says, no, comrades, you don't understand. It's much simpler than that. All you have to do is pull down the windows, rock back and forth, and pretend we're still moving. And this tells you everything you need to know about the Soviet society, which Mikhail Gorbachev inherited in 1985 and began to transform. Now here's where we get to the second thing that usually makes people mad. We in the United States typically understand the history of the Cold War in basically the following way. That is to say, if I walk down the street of almost any city in America, let's pick, I don't know, Springfield, and I ask people at random, why'd the Cold War end? And who won the Cold War? I'm going to get some variation of the following answer. Well, Ronald Reagan won the Cold War because he recognized Soviet inefficiencies, ramped up military spending, ramped up emotional and moral condemnation, and caused the Soviets to collapse. That is to say, Ronald Reagan said to the Soviets, tear down this wall, and they listened. In fact, most people have this vision, almost like Vladimir Putin, that he took off his shirt first and then said, tear down this wall. So it was more dramatic that way. This is wrong. This is fundamentally wrong. This is, by the way, dangerously wrong. Because first of all, it's ahistorical. That is to say, Soviet policymakers recognized they needed to change in the 70s, that is before Reagan took office. And in fact, most of the things that Reagan did in the early 1980s, I would argue, actually made things worse by making them more dangerous. That is to say, several times during the early 1980s, twice in particular during 1983, the world came about this close from global nuclear destruction. Because Soviet policymakers had this odd habit of listening when the President of the United States spoke and believing what he said, which used to seem not so odd. And Reagan, of course, came into office, as you know, claiming that we needed a crusade of fire to purge the world of communism, and that we are going to outspend the Soviets and ultimately keep them on the ash heap of history. And twice during 1983 in particular, Soviet officials witnessed American military operations exercises in the first instance, And then in the second instance, witnessed American missiles flying towards them and almost hit the button in response. Now, it turns out the first case was an exercise, and the Soviets finally talked themselves into recognizing that this was an exercise that, yes, it looked very real, but let's keep faith that it's just an exercise. The second, of course, was just a flock of geese. But in normal times, the people who are reading the radars, if you will, would have taken the time to have said, let's check our equipment, because why are they attacking us on a Thursday morning out of the blue? And usually after a few minutes, they would recalibrate and recognize it's a flock of geese. These were not normal times, I would argue, because of Reagan's rhetoric. And instead, the first response was to pick up the phone and call the Kremlin and say we're under attack. And of course, you can imagine what the Kremlin's response was: warm the missiles. Mikhail Gorbachev came into power in '85, making a change which I would argue had nothing to do, frankly, with Reagan, though ultimately the ability he was able to make progress depended upon Reagan. Here's a place where I would give Reagan great credit, that he was willing to extend his hand of friendship to a person who he had previously called an enemy and a state he had previously called evil. But make no mistake, that is not why the Soviets chose to respond. In fact, the way I like to think about this analogy is that Ronald Reagan, in many ways, was the person who says, I command the sun to rise, and then when it rises, takes credit for it. If you command the Soviets to collapse, and they collapse, you look pretty good. We now know, because we have access to what was actually going on inside the Kremlin, that's not really the way the causal arrow should go. But this does help to explain if the story is that perhaps Reagan, in American minds, in the late 80s, had caused the Soviets to make this change, and they brought to power a man in 1985 who wanted to change, but perhaps also wanted to save the Soviet Union. This calls into question basically the central problem that George Bush has in trying to understand how to avoid the rocky shoals of the stream of history moving in democracy's way. Because Reagan, ironically, for a man who had constantly said, trust but verify, in Bush's opinion, had not. That is to say, he had done nothing to verify one of two things, both of which were necessary for good strategy. The first was whether or not Mikhail Gorbachev was sincere in his reforms or simply doing it to buy time. Or the second is whether or not Mikhail Gorbachev, by initiating those reforms, by getting the communists, if you will, poised to be thrown onto the ash heap of history, could himself survive. Interestingly enough, George Bush, when he comes into office in 1989, and you would think that this would have been an easy, friendly transition, not only one Republican administration to another, but then ultimately a vice president taking over for a president. You would think that would be the story of continuity. And by and large, at the Commerce Department, at the Labor Department, at the Justice Department, it was. It was not at the State Department, where James Baker, the new Secretary of State, announced to the new employees when he showed up on the first day of work, this is a hostile takeover. In fact, he purged, and I use that word explicitly, purged the State Department of the upper echelons of Reagan's foreign policy team because he thought they had all trusted too much and gone too far, and we need to be more cautious with what to do with the Soviets. And in fact, the reason we need to be more cautious is exemplified by a memo that Bush received his first week in office, which essentially said the following: we predict there's going to be a conservative coup against Mikhail Gorbachev. That is to say, we, the intelligence agencies of the United States, collectively have come to the conclusion that there is going to be a backlash from true Soviet hardliners, from the KGB, from the Red Army, that Mikhail Gorbachev is ruining their dream of what the Soviet Union should be by incorporating these crazy Western ideas of democracy and markets. That's not who we were, and that's not what we were raised to be. So we are going to remove him from office. George Bush essentially receives the same exact memo every week for the next 2.5 years until it eventually becomes true. That is to say, by August of 1991, there is, in fact, that conservative coup against Gorbachev. But that context is important to understand how he deals with the problems he sees when taking office, which is to say, He sees very quickly the problems of how democracy can be crushed with tanks at Tiananmen. He knows the history of how democracy can be crushed in Europe. But he also knows if he works too closely, here's the hard part, too closely with Mikhail Gorbachev, supporting democracy, as Reagan had done, that might actually provide just the ammunition Gorbachev's enemies and adversaries need to tip them over the edge, to make them have that coup we all expect. On the other hand, it gets more complicated than that still. There's a multi-level problem. If George Bush ignores Gorbachev, well, that could undermine him politically and therefore help cause the coup that could lead to the crisis. And this is essentially the story of the Cold War's end, I would argue, is how George Bush and those around him managed to keep things calmly going in the forward direction without veering too much in either direction or in any direction. And let me give you a good example of this. The real problem that Bush had in managing this diplomacy is how much to say in front of the camera and how much to say behind the scenes. That is to say, and keep in mind, we're dealing with a president here who did not have Twitter, though I would argue if he did, he would not have used it. For the following reason, that is to say, when Bush saw crisis after crisis going on in Eastern Europe, and let me give you the best example, which is the fall of the Berlin Wall, a completely unexpected event, something no one anticipated, something that was never actually ordered, something that, I can go into this later, that was actually an accident, quite literally an accident. Bush and those around him, like leaders in London, like leaders in Paris, like leaders in Germany, like leaders in the Soviet Union, all watched the same video on the same CNN feed. It's really quite amazing. We actually have simultaneous pictures of them. You can do time frame stamping to see that Gorbachev and Bush and Margaret Thatcher are all literally watching the same image at the same time. And they're all having the same idea go through their head, which is, holy bleep. We didn't anticipate this. We didn't order this. We don't know what's going to happen next. So George Bush does two things, really insightful. He picks up the phone. He calls Thatcher. He ultimately calls Gorbachev. He calls Helmut Kohl. Not because he necessarily knows what to do, but because he knows he needs to maintain calm. And we need to maintain communications. And we need to continue talking quietly so nobody does anything rash, whether it's on the Western side or the Eastern side. But that's behind the scenes. What he does in front of the camera is even more remarkable and more impressive, especially to our 2018 eyes. That is to say, when Bush was watching the Berlin Wall on TV collapse, he was in a little office over to the side of the Oval Office, sitting there on a little small black and white television watching it with Brent Scowcroft, his national security advisor. And the two of them are watching, and they are completely dumbfounded. Nobody expected this, and they certainly didn't think it would ever happen in their lifetime. And here it was, in their eyes. Marlin Fitzwater, the press secretary, came to Bush and said, Mr. President, you need to give a statement. To be honest, Senate Majority Leader Mitchell, House Speaker Gephardt have already given statements talking about this being a great triumph for democracy, and in fact, trying to claim credit for the Democratic Party in all of this. So you, Mr. President, Fitzwater argued, have to go out and say something. Bush responded by asking him to go away. He said, I don't know what I would say. Now, I have to say, this repeats 3 more times over the course of the afternoon. Fitzwater coming in 3 more times and saying, Mr. President, you gotta say something. Till finally, George Bush consents, goes in, puts on a tie, puts on a jacket, gathers reporters around his desk in the Oval Office. And you can go on YouTube and watch this. It's really quite remarkable. Proceeds to speak for the next half an hour without saying anything. It is actually a remarkable master class in full sentence gibberish. Not whole half sentence, full sentence. The reason being, he knew whatever he said was immediately going to be viewed around the world on those same CNN cameras. And if he, as he put it in his own words, danced on the wall and beat our chest in triumph, that could be the thing that would cause Soviet hardliners to crack down, to have the coup. I mean, losing the Berlin Wall and losing East Germany, the crown jewel of the Soviet Empire, the reason that we had in Soviet minds won World War II and sacrificed all those lives in World War II to conquer these people now who appear to be leaving us. This is a very tenuous moment for the Soviets. In fact, Bush's press conference was so bizarre beautifully so, I would argue, but bizarre, that Leslie Stahl, the CBS reporter at the time, actually said to him by the end of the press conference, "Mr. President, I'm sorry, I have to ask, you don't seem very excited. Do you realize what just happened?" To be honest, what she was saying was, "You appear completely out of touch." To which Bush responded, "Well, I guess I'm just not an excitable guy." Now, the truth was, as I said, he knew exactly what was going on because he was having those conversations before and after that press conference with foreign leaders around the world. And we now know that because we have all the transcripts of those discussions. We actually now have every single transcript of every discussion Bush had with a foreign leader while he was in the Oval Office. But Bush understood that whatever he said in public would be heard. And more importantly, and this is the hard part to fathom, especially in 2018, he understood that he was going to take a serious hit in the polls by appearing to be less than in charge, by appearing to not have all the answers, by appearing to do what I like to refer to as Hippocratic diplomacy. That is to say, if things are going your way, first don't do any harm, don't make things worse. And he was very explicit with his advisors that I am going to suffer politically for what I know to be the best thing to do diplomatically, for what I know to be the best thing to do secretly for the nation. He did the same thing at Tiananmen Square, working behind the scenes while appearing to not be doing much in public. He did the same thing at German unification, working behind the scenes, achieving something not only that nobody thought was possible, but frankly that everyone else in Europe outside of Germany thought was a terrible idea. That is to say, we like to think that when the wall came down that unification was inevitable. The truth is it wasn't. That is to say, everyone else in Europe remembered that the last time the Germans had been together, it hadn't been so good for the rest of Europe. And in fact, I would argue this is a notion that transcends the Atlantic. In fact, the best evidence we have for this is actually by that noted statement, a long statement, but a statement, by that noted geostrategist David Letterman, who a week after the Berlin Wall fell, told his crowd the following. He said, "German unification will have 3 phases. First, economic integration. Second, political integration. And third, France surrenders." Now, the fact that you laugh means you understand the narrative of the joke is that when the Germans get together, they conquer. What's interesting is that everyone in Europe, and most importantly, each one of the 4 powers who had legal authority over Germany at the end of World War II, and therefore in 1989, that is to say, the French, the British, the Americans, and the Soviets, the big powers, if you will, after World War II, they would have to sign off on any transformation of Germany's legal and sovereign authority, which would be necessary for them to come together. 3 of the 4 were really against it. Margaret Thatcher in Britain, Francois Mitterrand in France, Mikhail Gorbachev in the Soviet Union. And basically all for the same reason. That is to say, they all had personal memories of World War II, and they were not fond memories. The only one of the big 4 who thought this was a good idea was George Bush. Why? Well, for 2 reasons, 2 really important reasons. The first is he thought times had changed. He thought that narrative about the Germans was not true anymore. They had been a democracy, he argued, for 40 years at that point, much like the Japanese, who he had fought against in the World War II. He thought a society could change and democracy could take hold. That was really the lesser reason. The more important reason is that the narrative I just told you, which is to say the reason why Europe keeps going to war, is not the way Bush understood it. In Europe, it was thought that the reason we keep going to war was one of 2 things, either because of the Germans, or more broadly, because of nationalism. That is to say, the French and the Germans and the Belgians and the Italians, so long as they keep thinking of themselves as that, are historically always going to fight. And in fact, the whole purpose of the European Union, which, as I mentioned earlier, is coming into being during this period, was to try to transform European identity from that nationalism into a broader continental-wide sense of being. First we formed the economics, then we formed the politics, and finally we'll start to think of ourselves not as British, French, or Germans, but as Europeans. Bush had a completely different reading of history. By the way, when I say Bush, I also mean every one of his major advisors, and by the way, Every single administration, I would argue, from Harry Truman up through Barack Obama, believed functionally the following thing about European history. That is to say, the real problem with European history, the reason they keep killing each other is because they're European. And that's what they do. And they're pretty good at it. Every 32 years or so, they get into a major continental-wide war. And the history of the 20th century from the American perspective is as follows. In World War I, you all tried to kill each other. We came over and saved the day. And being good, wholesome non-colonialists, we went home. Big mistake. After World War II, when we had to go back and do it again, even bigger shebang that time, we stayed. And you know what hasn't happened since? Bush argued in 89, 90. There hasn't been a European war since the Americans have been on site. Now, it doesn't matter whether there's causality or correlation. Bush wasn't interested in finding out. He believed that so long as Americans were on site as the biggest, most powerful, dominant power in Europe, the Europeans wouldn't fight each other. And certainly the Soviets wouldn't come in. Wasn't that the lesson of the Cold War? So therefore, Bush cuts a deal with Helmut Kohl, the leader of Germany, that basically falls down the following position. He tells Kohl, I will support you on unification. Nobody else will, but I'm the most powerful man in the world, and I have powers of levers of power, I should say, over the other three of the great powers. I can get them to do what I want. Trust me. But you have to do me something. It's kind of a mob boss mentality here. I do you a favor, you do me a favor. And the favor you're going to do me is a unified Germany will always remain a member of NATO. Why? Because NATO can't exist without Germany. It just doesn't make any sense. Germans provide the single most manpower promotion. They provide the #2 amount of money. That's where most of the major bases are. Germany makes sense for NATO, and NATO doesn't make sense without it. But without NATO, we, the United States, have no invitation and entry point to Europe. So NATO must survive so that we can maintain ourselves as a dominant power. Bush and Kohl cut this deal. And I would argue that's really the most important legacy, if you will, for Bush's foreign policy. Not only that he managed to successfully weather those rocky shoals, but recreate the structure of European strategic map with an American wing still attached. There's only one problem, and I'll end on this note, which is to say he was able to get, by being Bush, the British to go along with this, the French to go along with this, and ultimately the Soviets to go along with this, but that part wasn't so easy. That is to say, in February of 1990, while these negotiations are ongoing, James Baker went to Moscow, accompanied, we now know, because of new documentation that just came out about 3 years ago, by a young lad who did well for himself later named Bob Gates. And they both, Baker and Gates, in separate meetings, made the following pledge to the Soviets. If you agree with us that Germany should become unified in NATO, we promise that NATO will not expand, in Baker's words, 1 inch to the east. Gorbachev thought that was a pretty good deal. In fact, he said, you know what, we like the idea. We're not really against NATO expansion per se. In fact, maybe someday we'd like to join NATO, the Soviet Union. What's interesting about Baker's response, and Baker, of course, was a good lawyer, is that he didn't say no, and he didn't laugh. He said, you know, that's an interesting idea. In 30 or 40 years, maybe we should discuss that some more. Maybe that's when the East-West divide will have come down so much that we could think of NATO as the way to move forward collectively, as a partnership for peace, is what we called it in the 1990s, that idea. And the two left with a basic common understanding that NATO expansion would not happen so long as the Soviets acquiesced in German unification. Here's the kicker. Here's the one single most important reason why Vladimir Putin is mucking around in your elections and dislikes the United States today. I mentioned Baker was a lawyer. They never wrote the deal down. They never signed a treaty. They never even put it in a memorandum. Honestly, they never even shook hands on it. They basically had a sense of an agreement. And then, as would happen, the parameters changed. That is to say, it's very complicated, but essentially when Baker and Gorbachev were first arguing and discussing this, they were discussing the border of whether or not the border should be for NATO in the center of East Germany. That is to say, whether East Germany and West Germany should be one sovereign country, but with a border in the middle of it. The skeptical looks I'm getting is exactly the skeptical looks this idea produced, which is why they got rid of this idea and ultimately moved the border to the east. But then the question was, how far should it move to the east? Essentially, the deal the Soviets thought they had in place and never wrote down, they thought would still govern the spirit of subsequent American, Western European, Soviet, post-Soviet relations. But frankly, if you don't write it down in international politics, it doesn't exist. More importantly, if you don't write it down, it can't be binding upon subsequent administrations. Certainly not if they are from different parties. Remember, NATO expansion, which you all know occurred subsequently under Bill Clinton, Democrat, and then George W. Bush, another Republican, neither of whom felt in any way, shape, or form beholden to an offhand remark that a Secretary of State made in February of 1990 in the middle of all that tumult. But Gorbachev, and subsequently Yeltsin, and subsequently Vladimir Putin, they keep telling themselves they had a deal. And there are multiple reasons why the Russians are still nationalistically antagonistic towards the West, increasingly under Putin. But I would argue that whenever Vladimir Putin lists the reasons why the Russian people should not trust the West, number one on the list every single time is they broke their pledge about NATO expansion. A pledge that, like all great problems in international affairs, has just enough truth on both sides to be a really good argument. Both sides have just enough to be almost right-ish. And this is the environment that George Bush dealt with. This is the environment that George Bush negotiated quietly. These are the kinds of deals that he made in order, ultimately, I would argue, to keep the ship of state moving in a democratic, positive direction. In fact, I think ultimately this helps to explain Bush's sense of the New World Order. That is to say, a phrase that he was derided for having no originality when he used it. That is to say, people said the New World Order is nothing new, as you're describing it, President Bush. Bush's response was essentially, well, yes, that's exactly the point, isn't it? That the New World Order of 1991, 92, exemplified by the fall of the Soviet Union and ultimately by the Gulf War, when we stood up for United Nations sovereignty, is a world order that was envisioned and talked about our entire lives, but we could never implement it because the Cold War got in the way. The Cold War is now gone, and our new world order is going to be, in Bush's words, not perfect, but better. Not fully just, but more just. Not peaceful, but more peaceful. That is to say, it's not going to be perfect. The ship of state still has some ways to go. Our job is to make sure it keeps going in the right direction. And with that, I thank you for your time. So.
Wonderful, Jeff. Does anyone have questions for Jeffrey?
Sir.
Yeah, man, I just want to give you a lot of credit for what you were saying about Germany. To me, they were the antifreeze. Like, Germany was the deadbolt on the door. I was over there. I spent a lot of time over there, and it's complicated, but me not being the brightest bulb in the marquee, I understand this. Antifreeze and water work together. They're both catalysts. And without Germany, you don't have us. Without us, you don't have Germany. And you made a very good point on the fact that neither one can do it without the other. As far as keeping the engine cool, which is the antifreeze and the water working together. And you're the first person I've heard say that in 20 years, and it was worth coming down here to hear you talk.
You can ask a question anytime.
I just want to say thanks, because I got talked into a couple of friends here, and I was very skeptical. I'm like, I forgot I go. But, you know, like I said, I'm a stone barbarian as far as force over power, but you had a pretty good way of.
Well, and
things for those that are younger to understand.
well, and this is the reason in many ways why I'm nervous today, is twofold. The first is, if the basic structures of European peace since 1945 have been the idea that we're going to form an integrated continental union to transcend nationalism, and we're going to have the Americans there as the barbaric force, if you will, well, both of those are now eroding. As you know, European Union's having a little bit of trouble, and the Germans, have responded quite explicitly to President Donald Trump by saying, we no longer think the Americans are the leader of the free world. We will be the leader of the free world. Well, as a historian, I gotta tell you, that's not a great recipe, historically. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, you did a great job, and that's all I have to say.
Oh, thank you, sir.
Yes, sir.
Very fascinating. Got a question though. Gorbachev and the Soviet leadership saw that the economics of the Soviet Union were falling. Is it domestic politics that came in the way? Our intelligence knew it as well. That prevented a new Marshall Plan. In essence, because World War II ended, the U.S. steps in with the Marshall Plan, end of Cold War, Soviet economy's going down the tubes.
So this is a great question. There's two ways to understand this. The first is to understand what really happened in the Marshall Plan. And you're all familiar with the Marshall Plan, the U.S. aid to Europe for reconstruction after World War II. And then the second is how that applies to the end of the Cold War period. The first thing to know, in fact, let me tell you the second one first, which is to say, policymakers throughout the West and throughout the Soviet Union believed that when the Soviets and then ultimately the Russians transformed from a communist economy into a democratic free market economy, that was going to be really, really painful. That is to say, we expect standard of living to drop, we expect productivity to drop, we expect food to drop, we expect crime to rise. It's going to be hard. The question they wanted to figure out is, how hard can we keep it from getting? And obviously the Russians always were asking for more and more and more to try to alleviate the pain that they were getting. They got a lot of aid from the Germans, they got a lot of aid from the Europeans, they got a lot of aid from the Americans. Never enough for two reasons. First, because I would argue that there was nothing and no amount of money in the entire world that could have kept that transition from being a very painful one. There's simply, and this was something that policymakers at the time argued. We have lots of great documentation from Bush, from Kohl, in particular Bush and Baker arguing at the G7 summit in 1991 that we know the Soviets are asking us for money. We know whatever money we give them is basically going to be flushed down the toilet, because the truth of the matter is they're going to have a hard time, and that's going to hurt their population no matter what we do. There is not enough money in the world. And by the way, remember, we're also entering a recession at this time. There's just no money available. So how much do we need to titrate and give them so we can honestly say with a straight face, we gave you something, even though we think it's not going to have any effect, so that they don't feel that we didn't give them anything? Now, in truth, we didn't get that number right. And I would argue the reason we didn't get that number right is that there is no right number, that there was no amount of money in the world that would have given the Soviets and then the Russians an easy transition. And the reason we didn't goes back to the Marshall Plan, which is, now I guess this is going to be the third thing which I'll tell you, which will make you mad. In American textbooks, we teach our students that the Americans created the Marshall Plan because they saw Europe struggling after World War II, needing economic aid, needing a restructuring of their manufacturing base in particular, and needing raw supplies to do it. And we gave it to them out of the goodness of our heart. As a historian, the technical term for that is bupkis. We gave it to them explicitly for two reasons. The first is because there was a great concern among the Truman administration that if Western Europe didn't get revitalized, who the heck is going to buy our products? And that will essentially be drawn back into the Great Depression. But then the second most important reason is that if we don't get Western Europe revitalized, in destroyed, unproductive labor force is a prime breeding ground for communism. And if we don't have a bulwark against communism, our enemy will succeed. So the problem with the Russians, in addition to the fact that there's no amount, in 1989, 99, 90, 91, 92, in addition to the fact there's no amount of money that I think that's going to keep them from bottoming out, is there's no enemy. The enemy, when there is only, remember Fukuyama said there's only one form of government left, and now you've become a democratic state if you're Russian. There's no one that Bush or Clinton can go to Congress about and say, you need to fund Russian reconstruction or else they'll be democratic. That doesn't, remember, looking back, it sounds silly. But remember the times, with the great democratic revolution, it appeared that this was something that was going to stick. Yes, sir?
Wasn't the enemy nuclear war? And what happens if Russia decides to sell some of those nuclear weapons to rogue nations?
Oh, we worked on that on a separate level. Yeah, we went in, and this was both the the Bush administration and subsequently the Clinton administration under Nunn-Lugar went in and tried to make sure that we do a couple things. We help the Soviets and the post-Soviet states, the Russians and the post-Russian Soviet states, increase their nuclear security. We buy off states like Ukraine and Kazakhstan to get them to transfer their nuclear weapons back to Russian control. By the way, imagine what happens when Vladimir Putin tries to take over Crimea and Ukraine if Ukraine still had nuclear weapons. So that's a pretty good win. And the third thing that we do is we set up a whole lot of think tanks in Western universities to make sure that Soviet nuclear physicists have someplace really good to work. Really. And that's a bargain. I mean, you have no idea how cheap those people will work. But you'd rather have them work in Stanford, by the way, helping to fund the internet revolution, than have them go to, I don't know, North Korea. So, sir.
One other thing, and then I'll be quiet. One of the things that kind of did make me angry was the fact that you poo-pooed Reagan. And Brezhnev was not in power all the way to 85.
Right. I had to simplify something for the sake of time. I was already over.
So, if it started in the 70s, the Soviet leadership had their opportunity to make a change to a younger generation. They had a couple opportunities and they didn't go there.
Well, why does that have anything to do with Reagan?
Because it didn't happen until after Reagan was in office.
Your chronology is off. So, Brezhnev is alive through Reagan's inauguration. So, the Soviets had several occasions to make a change in response to Reagan's rhetoric and chose not to. The reason was because of the sclerosis of the Soviet system. It isn't until Gorbachev comes in, who is not only a revolutionary, I mean, honestly, I put Gorbachev in the top 5 most influential people in the 20th century for this fundamental reason, that he was willing to be a genuine revolutionary and open his society up for fundamental change. And when I say fundamental change, please understand, what Gorbachev was talking about revising Soviet dogma from 85 on, would be akin to the Pope saying, we need to rethink that Trinity thing. I mean, these are fundamental dogmas that he was talking about revising, and very few politicians had the guts to do that, and it had nothing to do with what the Americans were saying. Now, I will tell you, one area where Reagan was useful is that Gorbachev came to the conclusion that what we really can't afford to do is to keep spending all this money on the military, not because of what Reagan was doing, because the trend lines from the 60s and 70s we were increasingly inefficient. And by the way, the price of oil has dropped, so we really can't afford this anymore. So how can we find some way to reduce our military spending? Oh, wait a minute, maybe we can work with that Reagan guy, who, by the way, is terrified of what he almost did blowing up the world in 1983, and has changed his opinion entirely on how to negotiate with us. Maybe we can work together. So there's a place you can give Reagan credit, that Reagan finally was able to agree to something that Gorbachev wanted anyway.
So let me say this about Jeff. I've had a number of arguments with Jeff through the years. He's fundamentally wrong on Reagan, but I love the guy anyway. He's brilliant. I think it's kind of unfair to say Reagan almost blew up the world in '83 just because the Soviets overreacted to a flock of geese into normal exercises that we were doing. But you said it's based on rhetoric of Reagan, but believe me, I've been doing this for how many years? I will not win this fight. He's a very difficult guy to debate on that, so I defer to you, sir. I know we had another question here.
You know that Alan used to work personally for Ronald Reagan.
And that's where I saw the genius that was Reagan.
Yeah. Oh, ma'am, please.
How would you describe the Soviet Union today, or whatever today? The government is not, and the state of their economy. Is it back to being, is it going bizarre?
That's Yeah, so the question was how do they understand the Russians today?
Their state of being, are they?
So the best way, I think, to continue to understand them is, as James Baker described them at the end of the Cold War, which is upper Volga with nuclear missiles. That is to say, the Russian economy is not particularly impressive. Russian universities at this point are not particularly impressive. The Russian are suffering dramatically on international bond markets because of the way Putin has been acting. But they still have a lot of bluster because they still have a lot of weapons. And of course, you just all saw the video last week of how they're planning to nuke Fort Lauderdale. My grandmother no longer lives there, so I'm less bothered by that. So ultimately, I think what Vladimir Putin has done is play an incredibly weak hand incredibly well by finding the fissure points in Western society that essentially he can not necessarily manipulate, because that gives him a little bit too much credit, but finding the places where we are not necessarily as strong as we should be. And I'll give you a great example. We are exercised in this country, and I think rightly so, over the fact that the Russians meddled in the 2016 election. In fact, every single member of the United States government today, except the President of the United States, will say that. Put that aside. What is more troubling to me is the way that they meddled in the Brexit election, the Brexit vote, which you remember was a very close-run thing the year before. And ultimately, we believe now that they were very effective at making that 2 or 3% difference happen to destroy the European Union. Why? Because the weaker Western institutions are, the better it is for a person with a weak hand to play. So ultimately, I think we need to be stronger and stand up for the fact that we can use ledgers to realize that this is not a state that is particularly imposing, except for nuclear weapons. And here's the thing. If they start using nuclear weapons, yeah, I mean, really. I mean, you really can't plan a strategy for Armageddon, because that means everything has gone wrong. So let's try to work around other options.
What about this, excuse me, the political state? I mean, they're not a democracy.
No.
Do they propose to be? Do they pretend to be?
They pretend to be.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Well, Saddam Hussein, to give Vladimir Putin credit, he is going to win the election, but not nearly by the percentage that Saddam Hussein used to win. But it's close. So one of the problems that I have with the way in which we frame what happened at the end of the Cold War, which largely is, how do we get from this moment of the Russians being friendly and our friends and perhaps being democratic to where they are now, is that we, in many ways, take the blame upon ourselves. I mean, I think both economically and strategically and politically, we say, what could we have done different? The onus of whether a country stays democratic ultimately has to fall down upon its own people. I think if there's any statistic that tells us that Russia is not a full functioning democracy, it's not actually the voting statistics in Russia. Those are comical. The real statistic is that Vladimir Putin, who in 1990 left East Germany, he was stationed as an intelligence officer in East Germany, left East Germany and went back to Leningrad with literally a 20-year-old car and a 20-year-old washing machine as his only possessions. And that he is today the single richest man in the world, suggests to me he did not do everything by the books. So that's, I think, a more important metric. Yes?
I'm going to keep you in 2018, so I'm sorry.
I love 2018.
Well,
Actually, no, I don't.
you opened by talking about Fukuyama and China, and Fukuyama published an article in the Washington Post today on China,
Oh, I didn't see it.
arguing that Xi Jinping, by making himself, I probably mispronounced his name, making himself leader for life, has basically laid the seeds of Chinese collapse, because it was their term limits that was keeping China vibrant and was the reason they were succeeding. And so I've A, if you don't engage in fiction, that's fine, but do you agree with Fukuyama? And B, how does that fit with the overall New World Order argument that he put forward back then?
Yeah. So the Chinese, after 1989, are running an experiment that nobody else in history has successfully done. That is to say, throughout the world, it is axiomatic that countries that become more democratically market-oriented and more capitalist and give their people more economic power ultimately wind up having to give them more political power. Why? Well, it's actually very, very simple logic. When you are starving and have nothing, you care about getting food. When you have food, you care about getting shelter. When you have shelter, now suddenly you care about whether I can vote. But you only care about political liberalism when you have economic development. And the Chinese are trying to run counter to that theory. That is to say, they have, after 1989, cut the following deal with their people. They said, we will give you economic development, but no political development. And that has never happened before in human history. In fact, this goes back to your point. One of the things that the Russians have done is bucked the trend in a different direction by saying, we're going to give you economic liberty, but we're going to take away the democratic part, but give you the facade of democracy. That's one way you could do it. So I don't know whether Xi's decision to assume presidency for life is ultimately what's going to do in the Chinese. In fact, I'm actually rather skeptical about that. What I think is a better problem to worry about for the Chinese is the fact that their level of economic inequality still outrivals anyone in the world, although we are trying our best to match them. And the problem for the Chinese is not really what to do with the Americans. It's not really what to do with the Uyghurs. It's not really what to do with their problems with South Asia. The problem for the Chinese is that they have 400 million people still living below the poverty line who have televisions and who can see what's going on the coast. So I think if Xi is interested in solving the problems, if he thinks it's best to do it by making himself president for life or not, that seems to me a superficial issue. I'm not sure that anything he can do on that political realm is going to solve the problems that they have economically, because I don't see any case in history, I'm a historian, where somebody has run that experiment of giving economic liberalization without political liberalization and had it be successful. So my money is, put your money on the Japanese.
One more question.
I'll let you get back to 1989. Is there any indication of how had Dukakis been elected, how he may have led differently in this time period?
That's a great question. I actually tried to get him to answer that question. He wouldn't answer my email. Yeah.
Did he give any indication in any?
It's really incredibly hard to answer because George H.W. Bush was arguably the person with the single best resume, in particular for foreign policy, of anyone to come into the presidency, perhaps ever. And the only one you might give him a run for his money is Dwight Eisenhower. Mike Dukakis had a very, very good domestic economic record. He had zero foreign policy experience. And when I say zero, I can't emphasize how small the zero is. And he knew it. So it's really hard to predict what he would have thought. I can tell you that I think his response to Tiananmen would have been much, much different than Bush's, because the hardliners of the Democratic Party in particular were those, this is where Nancy Pelosi, by the way, becomes famous, were those who really wanted to crack down on China after Tiananmen in a way that Bush thought was imprudent for the future. Bush argued that Tiananmen Square was a terrible thing. We condemn it, but we can't imagine the Chinese aren't going to be important players in the 21st century, so how can we get back to talking with them? And by the way, if the contagion of democracy is actually what caused the convulsion within Tiananmen Square, the last thing you want to do is remove Western contacts. You want to keep the contagion coming in, so keep engagement going as much as possible. I think Dukakis most likely would have listened to those around him on that issue, who would have said, no, 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 the answer is isolate China. And then we get a completely different history of the 21st century.
Well, you
He's gonna agree with me again, so can you call on him?
Okay, well, if you want to agree one more time, yes, sir.
I'm not a big fan of the nation of China, but like to me, Tiananmen Square is like growing pains. And it's no different than our Kent State. And we worked it out. And countries still dealt with us after Kent State, which was horrible. So you had Tiananmen Square, which is a coming power, and you got to deal with it, so you got to forgive a little bit as well. So yeah, that's a good point.
You know, even better than Kent State is, recall, if you will, your history lessons about the bonus marchers in 1932. And if you haven't looked at that lately, go Google it, and you'll see pictures of American tanks and flamethrowers destroying civilian huts and tents on the National Mall of people who were protesting. We have done this too. The question is, what do you do the next day? And I think the next day, the Chinese had a different response than the American government did. So,
Please join me in thanking Jeff.
thank you all.